Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of September 8th. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm joined again today by Josh Blank, Director of Research for the Texas Politics Project. It's the week after Labor Day. Are you ready for the beginning of the campaign, Josh? The beginning of the serious phase of the campaign?
Yeah,
I should say, it's the week after Labor Day. Are you sick of the campaign and looking forward to it being over?
Oh, God. Are we having fun yet? That's a Party Down reference. Anyway, no, I'm not. But we'll deal with it.
Right. Well, and we should note that Josh is also a father, and it's back to school day in the Central Texas area in the Austin Independent School District for Josh. And so you also are, sort of back to being a schoolhouse, I guess.
Yeah, you can tell by the tears.
Nice. So today what we thought we would spend most of our time doing is something that we do all the time, but to talk about where we are with polling in the 2020 cycle. Obviously there's been a lot of polling in Texas because of all the discussion of partisan change state and the possibility that, well, not even the possibility, the impression that people have, which I think is fair enough, that Texas is more competitive than it's been. That's driving a lot more polling in the state this cycle. And obviously there's a lot more polling in the presidential race. And we wrote about this very briefly a couple of weeks ago, I guess, in one of our weekend, maybe it was even last week.
It may have been last week. It was long.
It might even have been last week. We write about it. We complain and bitch about it so often that it feels like we're always writing about it, but maybe not. But what we thought today would be a good day, given that it is the week after Labor Day, and though I was joking about it, it is the period when, despite the fact that we know the campaign has been going on for literally years, in a lot of ways at the presidential level for sure, this is the period of time when people start paying more attention in the general public. For, anybody listening to this, it's probably not true of you, I would think. But for most people, particularly given, to say the least, what a crowded public, discussion it's been, and how crowded the environment has been in terms of public policy and issues out in the public sphere with the pandemic. There's a lot going on, and I think people would be forgiven if they're not paying a ton of attention to the ins and outs of the presidential race. That doesn't mean they don't have preferences or, but I mean the depth and extent of attention given all the stuff going on, probably more than it's been past, perhaps, and we can talk about that. But this is a time when people start, and it's not a bad time to start talking about polling, to talk again about polling, because there's going to be a lot more polling in the public sphere. I mean, as we get to the post-Labor Day, there are going to be people polling, there's going to be new polling multiple times a week, and within a couple of weeks, we'll be getting new polls almost daily in one race or another.
Well, and just the flip side of this, you were sort of mentioning the fact that people aren't paying attention, and, a lot of people aren't paying attention for a lot of reasons. It's the summer. Right. Again, if you're listening to this, you probably pay attention all summer. Most people are taking vacations or either dealing, with having their kids at home. They're just doing
taking vacations,
taking vacations, or just doing other things. But the other side of it too, even sort of outside of this is when the campaigns also begin, to really start spending their money. Right. So that's the other piece of this too. Is
unless you're the Trump campaign.
Well, unless you spent all your
money a few months ago on Brad Parscale's driver.
Well, anyway, that's
reference to the New York Times story this morning.
Right. But in general, historically and traditionally, this is when you start spending your money. And that's both on the advertisements you're going to run, but it's also, all the sort of get out the vote work, you're getting all your volunteers to go out and start knocking on doors, again, setting aside COVID. This is when this all starts to begin. And I think it's important to remember too, we were still having primaries in the summer. Like technically the race, I mean, we just had the national conventions a few weeks ago, which is when they actually nominated the candidates, even if we knew who they were beforehand. And so there's a lot of reasons that they think that we generally tend to think of Labor Day as the official start of the campaign.
So given that as a marker, one of the things that we've talked about is just the kind of the practices that are followed, not just in polling per se, but in the way that polls make their way out into the public, what we call disclosure. And you've looked at polling as we've been putting together and updating our poll tracker on the Texas Politics Project website with the release of every president or most presidential polls in Texas. We've had to make some decisions about policy and what we ought to include and what we shouldn't. And one of the things that we found in looking at these is that the level of disclosure is, despite, years of discussion about disclosure, and 2016 was a watershed, but it really predated 2016, and we can talk about that. Looking at stuff, we found really uneven disclosure in the polling that's been going on here, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so, what are we talking about when we're talking about disclosure? I mean, ultimately, the things that, we want to know. So as someone who looks at polls professionally, right? If I find that a poll just got released and there's some article, and let's say it's on ABC News or some website, and it says, here's some top line result, Biden leads Trump or Trump leads Biden or whatever, right? The first thing I do when I get to that article is I try to go through and basically look for the link that takes me to the actual disclosure of this poll. The poll disclosure is not the article that tells you the result. The poll disclosure is what tells you how the poll was actually conducted. It usually includes a methodology statement that tells you, who was contacted, right? How they were contacted. Was it, by phone? Was it a landline, telephone, cell phone, some combination? Was it done online? Was it a combination of all three? So who was contacted? How many of them were contacted? How were they contacted? When were they contacted? Why might that be important? Well, I mean, imagine if you were to do a poll right before a debate where one candidate had a major gaffe, and then a poll right after a debate where a major, candidate had a major gaffe. You might expect to see differences in the polling results.
I mean, most recently before or after the convention.
Sure.
Something people have been paying attention to recently.
But something potentially consequential, you want to know when the poll was conducted, right? And that's kind of the beginning. Then you also want to know what was done with the data. We have all these things, in polling we have this thing called non-response bias. Ultimately, some people are more likely to respond to polls than others. And so ultimately, almost every pollster has to weight the data to kind of account for that correction. Well, how was it weighted? Just ultimately, what were the relevant characteristics that we weighted back to? Usually it's race, age, and gender, but ultimately, this should be made pretty clear to people. And then finally, we finally get to that top line item, and that's not really enough, because the question is not only, first of all, how specifically was the question asked? Because that's important, because ultimately, people say to us all the time, well, if you ask that question a different way, wouldn't you get different results? And the answer almost assuredly is yes. It's a different question. So ultimately, you want to see how the question was asked, and you also want to see what else was on the poll and what the sequencing was. Because ultimately, there was a recent poll that purported to show a trial ballot result between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in a state to remain nameless. And this question was, I think about 50 or 60 questions into the poll, the entirety of which up to that point was basically an evaluation of the state of the government's COVID response. Ultimately, then at that point, your evaluation of the presidential ticket basically becomes like, imagine if we had a campaign that was totally about evaluating how COVID was doing, and then we asked you how you were going to vote. I mean, that's basically what you're simulating and something like that. But you wouldn't know that unless you saw the actual questions and the order of the questions. And so these are all things that we think about as being, pretty important in disclosure. You could go a step further. You could provide the actual data set. There's other things that people could provide further, but this is kind of what we think of. How did you conduct the poll? Who were you talking to? What did you ask? And ultimately right now, we're
how.
in this.
Yeah. What did you ask and how in terms of what order and wording?
Right.
Yeah.
And ultimately, this is important because you can't really evaluate the quality of a poll without this information. I would say that, I'm not even trying to be, I'm not trying to overstate it. You literally cannot evaluate the quality of any result you see that doesn't have most of this information available to you. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that I think that's most true, and I'm not disagreeing. I'm splitting hairs here, but and I'll tell you why in a second. I think it's particularly true when you're talking about election preferences and attitudes that are not well formed, strongly held. But particularly election preferences. I mean, and I think your idea about your account of the poll in which that the trial ballot was question 53, as I recall, is, I think a pretty good example of that. And the reason that I'm flagging that is just because, look, we push out a lot of policy attitudes that don't have that information directly linked to what we're pushing out. I mean, you kind of have to go find it a little bit. But I think the point holds, and that's really what we're sort of talking about here, is that, you've got to be able to find that information somewhere. I guess I'm talking about accessibility rather than disclosure to some degree. And I think, it's something I sometimes about with social media and my own internet, in which, I spend, more time than I should probably relative to my responsibilities, pushing out individual, poll results that we've gotten that seem relevant to the public discourse. And, I've surrendered to, the tyranny of Twitter, and that, every tweet doesn't say, here's a result on gun attitudes. And if you want to look at where this was in the poll and look at the questionnaire, you can also find all that here. And, all things being equal, I would like to be doing that more, but I don't want to muddy the point, but that's kind of what I'm thinking.
But it makes a good, but I think it transitions as well. I mean, it makes a good point, which is just to say, ultimately though, we don't expect most normal people to say, well, wait a minute. Now there's, I want to see exactly where that gun control question was in that exact poll, and how, and what was asked before and what was asked after.
Well, on Twitter, they just jump to the alternate favored wording that would have helped their position. But
sure. And, and that's fine. Right. And again, most people are not going to do that. They're going to engage with the material. I would say, in our case, we've been conducting these polls in Texas for over a decade and have made every bit of information available that we possibly can, if not, as accessible as possible, certainly available and certainly willingly, very willing to answer people's questions. But the thing is for most people, right, they're not going to do that. But then the question becomes, well, who are the gatekeepers who provide this information to other people? And are they both willing and able to do that kind of let's say a quality check before presenting this? Because ultimately what polling results become is they become a quick shorthand reference for people about the nature of the race. Right.
Yeah. And I think, in a way it's I think at some point I probably swore to myself I would never use this, but yet another broken vow to myself. There is a matter of there's a difference between disclosure on the surface in a way that becomes to the discourse, but a ready ability to show your receipts, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I guess what we're talking about in terms of the ongoing, or what we're talking about in terms of the ongoing discussion of this. But this really does come down to what are best practices and who should be responsible for them. What kind of reliability in this area should casual readers of political information, and particularly news media, expect? And I think that's really what we've been noticing, is that we're seeing, a lot of reporting to some degree in what we think of as traditional general audience outlets. We can't just call it the news media anymore because there's so much, but, newspapers, magazines, professional journalism outlets, reporting on polls with really uneven levels of disclosure. And I think it's kind of striking given, for two reasons: that it feels to me like, pre-2016, there was a certain amount of enforcement and gatekeeping on this. And frankly, sometimes early on, I resented it because we were using the internet before a lot of other people were. And there were gatekeepers at some of the national media outlets, some of them, that I won't mention, the New York Times, were, draconian about this beyond reasonableness in terms of just, adopting as a best practice the idea that, if you use the internet to collect your data, by definition, it wasn't legit. Now, some of those attitudes are still, kind of out there, in corners, among, mostly, I think, frankly, older professionals. But I think, but it points to the fact that you do expect I think it's okay to expect that journalism outlets will have policies about them and that their readers can rely on them. And that seems to be going in a direction that I'm a little bit surprised by.
And I would even add a little more complexity, at least to the pre-2016, because I would say the other element outside of sort of the journalism outlets that had some sort of odd and idiosyncratic kind of hard and fast rules about what they would and wouldn't report was that, most of the policing that was going on, if you could even call it that, came from poll aggregators. Various, basically websites that would go and create forecasting models off of the work of other pollsters. And to the extent that there was some policing going on in the Twitter space and stuff like that, it was often around, whether or not disclosure sufficed enough to basically feed the models. In a lot of cases, it wasn't really about disclosure for understanding how a poll was conducted. It was just so that they could basically manage some degree of uncertainty into their models. And again, that leads to other problems. Again, you said the arc through this, of course, is a 2016 election where a lot of people said, oh boy, the pollsters really got this wrong. Now, we could rehash this a million times. In the really quick version of this, nationally, the pollsters were spot on. They predicted a narrow Hillary Clinton win in the popular vote. She basically hit that mark. Most of the statewide polling in states that had good, consistent statewide polling had pretty accurate polling. The problem was there were a handful of consequential states in the election where there was not a long history of good polling. And a lot of these models that predicted, 95% chances of Hillary Clinton wins, which I say a model is not a poll. It's a byproduct of it, right? We're taking these sort of, kind of low quality.
And in fact, the model may
polls.
integrate polling, but not rely solely on it.
Right. And exactly. And so brought that stuff in, said Hillary Clinton has a 95% chance of winning. As I've said many times, no pollster would ever run a poll and say, this candidate has a 95% chance of winning. It's just not in our DNA usually to say something like that. And then when she lost, everyone said, oh, well, the polls are really messed up. Now, the funny thing is that the polling community took this very seriously, and ultimately, issued a bunch of postmortem reports, really went to look into the problems and basically said, hey, this is actually a pretty narrow problem, but there are things we can do to improve this. In the aftermath of that, I think the media
and you should, you should say what those were.
The main sort of thing is to basically is an acknowledgement of the under consideration of college education in polling and making sure that there's enough representatives of non-college educated respondents in basically survey samples.
And that showed up mainly at the level of state level polling, and pointed to the other to the other point, which is the quantity of quality polling at the state level, which was also a problem that was underlined in that report.
Right. So then in the aftermath of that, I think the media got really tough and they started saying, all of a sudden, you'd get an email from CNN or somewhere, and they would want all kinds of really, I would call them almost like deep statistics on the quality of the poll. So we're talking about, they wanted to know response rates, they wanted to know coverage rates, all these sorts of, terminology that does not matter for the purpose of the podcast, but the sort of thing that I would say even goes beyond kind of the normal disclosure we talked about into some pretty extensive nuts and bolts. So that was going on for a while, and it seemed like, and for a long time, even getting any polling result covered in a newspaper required, basically giving them a full methodology statement, regardless of your track record, whatever. Fine, it's great, right? But you kind of jump ahead now.
I would say that was mainly national outlets.
That was mainly national. Well,
yeah.
It was some state outlets. It was definitely national outlets, but there was definitely a lot more care given, I think, for a while in terms of what polls people were willing to report or not. And now we've kind of hit this point where it almost seems like, ultimately our appetite for polling is no less. It seems as just sort of, as a people, the media's appetite for polling is no less as a people. And then, and so what you're starting to see now is you're starting to see pollsters, I think, sort of, I would say doing intermittent disclosures. So especially these pollsters who do sort of we call these sort of weekly tracking polls or, every other week tracking polls. Basically, a lot of them are sort of falling back on, well, I disclosed it at the beginning how I'm going to do this. So therefore going forward, I don't have to disclose this anymore.
And you're thinking mainly about entities with media partners, right? For the most part.
These are almost solely entities with media partners. So ultimately, there's no reason for them not to report this information. They have the space, they've got the words, they could do it. But a lot of them are now sort of saying, well, we've reported this once, and then you just don't see anything after that. Now, this may or may not be important, but look, I'm just going to name names for one because it was last week, right? But Morning Consult released a poll last week. They do this kind of on a weekly. They do a lot of polling. Ultimately, they basically were looking for post-convention bounces. They looked at a bunch of different states. Gist of it was they didn't find anything big except in Arizona. But for example, in Texas, they found that, I think they had Trump up by 1 point before the convention. They had him up by 1 point after the conventions, but nowhere at all. And we emailed Morning Consult and, but nowhere at all could you find the sample size or the margin of error for this poll. Now, does that matter? Well, when you're proposing that there's a 1 point race, it kind of does. If you're proposing that there's a 2 point race, you kind of want to know if the margin of error is 2.5 or 3 points or whether it's 1.5 points. And they have big samples, so it could be very small, but ultimately it's kind of hard to know. And also that doesn't even add to the fact of all the other stuff, which is, it's a purported poll of likely voters. Who are those people? I don't know. And we can talk about that, but ultimately, likely voters are a group of voters who don't exist until the election. So ultimately, there's a lot of uncertainty in something like that. But, Morning Consult has done a bunch of polling, has disclosed how they've done it previously. So ultimately, they kind of get given a pass. But then there's this other sort of thing that goes on that I find even to be more pernicious, which is that, sort of a lot of media outlets that generally seem to have pretty strict standards for what's going to sort of be published under their masthead, whether digital or otherwise. But if it's in a newsletter, all bets are off.
Right. So let's pause for a second and stop and say, so I mean, I think once you move into this, there's a piece that is about media habits, and I think this is tied a little bit to shifts in the business model, among media outlets to where, you have premium newsletters. Now, some of this are new offshoots, or they're relatively new. I mean, last decade, but are offshoots of established that are generating revenue with insider, more premium information. And as you say, I mean, I think there's two things going on. One is that pollsters, and this gets us into from public polling also into campaign polling, have figured out that this is a way to inject their results into the bloodstream, even if the mainstream outlets still have enough standards to not release campaign polling. This campaign polling finds its way into the newsletters and still finds its way into the political bloodstream, that in the kind of information economy. That way, it's become a workaround to all the work in the public discussion about disclosure. That's one of the things that is also feeding the kind of fluctuation in the standards at the national level in the more public outlets, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that's an interesting point. I think that's right too. And then part of it is just, we sort of say, well, why is this? Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why, journalists would report, on the one hand say, I can't report this, under the masthead, but I can put this in a newsletter. There's all kinds of justifications, that kind of go through that you can imagine. But part of it also is just keeping up, right? I mean, ultimately, if an outlet's going to cover it, you sort of have to have an answer as to why you're not going to cover it. Right. And
and right now, I think that's right. And there's get into the cycle, we started, with belaboring the point of Labor Day. There's such a, you take Texas example and what we're seeing in the Texas media, real appetite among insiders and professionals to find out what's going on in the congressional and state district races as the environment gets more competitive. Everybody wants to know, like, hey, what are you hearing? And what you're hearing is stuff that is being paid for by campaigns and interest groups. And that is the stuff that is being either used internally and leaked out, sometimes just via, personal relationships. Somebody goes, oh, hey, yeah, look, I just got this, and you happen to be somewhere and they show it to you on your phone. A lot less of that going on right now. And some of it is a campaign saying, hey, we want to change the discussion. There have been stories about this race. We want the impression to be that this race is close or not close. And so you send a reporter a selective leak, which is not subject to any of the means of disclosure in most likelihood, or you just issue a press release and hope somebody will pick it up. And to get back to where we started on this little piece, now that stuff gets picked up in the newsletters all the time.
Yeah, and the key point here is, and I think if you're sitting here saying, well, how's that different than anything else? I think the point you should, that people need to acknowledge is, have you ever heard of a campaign release any of its internal polling in any way that made them look bad? I mean, they just don't. I mean, ultimately, if you, I mean, the sort of things that you're citing, especially these sort of looks into congressional and state house races. I mean, ultimately, if the poll is coming out of, a Democratic campaign, without fail, the Democrats are up in that race, or they're within striking distance if it's a race that, they don't necessarily expect to win, and vice versa for Republicans. If Republican campaigns are releasing polls, you never see a poll in which it's not being mobilized to some strategic advantage, whether it's either to say, hey, look, we're so far up, nobody should put any money on the other side. Again, a strategic consideration.
Right.
Or, hey, we're only up a little. We really need money. Right.
Yeah.
Or, hey, we're within striking distance of taking this seat back. We really need money. It's basically, ultimately, it's more of a fundraising tool than anything else. But the idea that this is somehow like insider information, it's like, it's not. Again, there's no way to evaluate these because I've never seen a campaign poll release with any, with almost, I would say, with anything but the most minimal amount of disclosure, if any disclosure at all.
Yeah. Every now and then, if somebody's trying to really push it, they'll give you, I wouldn't say never in my experience, but I'm older than you.
Well, but I would say no. I would say I've seen some disclosure from time to time, but even then, I think it's mostly been, notably incomplete, right? Like, maybe they show you the 4 questions that they asked out of whatever, right? And so, I think that's the thing that's a little bit nerve-wracking right now. I think as someone, as a public pollster, we not that we're sitting here trying to police other people, but ultimately we're trying to do good work. We're trying to provide people with good information about where the electorate stands on a number of issues and on races. And then ultimately, there are a bunch of people who are, I'd say mostly in the campaign space. I think most people are trying to do good work generally for what they're trying to do. But the point is that, whereas our goal is sort of a public pollster is working for, a university and a media outlet is to provide information, period. We don't have a stake in the outcomes. We're just trying to basically shoot it as straight as possible. But to the extent that, it's hard to open a newsletter, I think these days it's getting even harder still as we get toward the election, without some campaign poll purporting to tell us now, what's going on in these races with no way to evaluate it and no reason to believe, absent, again, any disclosure, that there aren't motivations for releasing these results.
Right. I think what I would even extend it to beyond, we probably have slightly different views of this a little bit, but I'm kind of most, I'm less offended as somebody that conducts polls than I am, or offended is the wrong word. I'm less bothered by this dynamic, from the principle of polling than I am the principle of what the public discourse looks like. And that's what makes it hard, to me, is like, trying to be part of, a rational evidence-based discussion when people are injecting poor evidence into the discussion, or poorly disclosed or, footnoted, for lack of a better term, evidence, it's problematic. And I think to connect all these dots in a way, that is why disclosure kind of plays a role, because disclosure, particularly of the methods, means how something was done. And I think that you have to also remember that the organizational and political context of campaign polls that are released out in public is different from the process that takes place in public polling. And we got a little glimpse of this, and it's now been 8 or 10 years, but a few election cycles ago, there was a candidate in a primary who lost a race that everybody thought that candidate should have won. That candidate, frankly, among blaming everybody but himself, blamed the pollster. And the pollster said, look, I provide lots of memos and assumptions about what the electorate might look like. I give them to the campaign. It's up to the campaign to use, based on my advice, what they use, and certainly to release what they're going to release. Now, that seemed like a little bit of just a little blip in the aftermath of a campaign that had gone south. But I think it gave us a glimpse into what happens inside campaigns, which is different than what you're seeing in public polling, which is, campaigns are given lots of different polling results. They get lots of, different versions of what the result might look like based on different, and they get to choose what they release. And that is a fundamentally different scenario. Look, we may think about different weighting schemes, but ultimately we're settling on the best picture that we think is most accurate. That's not what's going on in the process. That's not the objective of a campaign poll release. It's a completely different, as you were talking about motivations earlier. It's a different motivation. not just at how the release, what how you disclose it or who sees it, but what your ultimate, the purpose of the exercise is when that data become public.
Yeah, and just
Those
you're
data
wrapping it
become
around.
public.
I'm going to wrap it around again. I mean, I think
good.
the other. Here we go. We're gonna full circle it twice. We're back where we started. But anyway, I mean, the other piece. But I think that's why they are different things when you're talking about again public media polls and sort of their level of disclosure or not on the one hand, and campaign polls and their level of disclosure or not. But I think you can't help but look at it in this overarching context of there was a push, and I would say there still sort of is, to require pollsters to provide this basic information about how you did a poll.
Yeah.
I think it makes me nervous, again, whether as a pollster or whether as someone who's interested in the public discourse. There are always going to be journalists and outlets that are going to report on campaign polls because they feel they're insidery. They feel like insider information. They're sexy.
It's market driven. That's their market segment.
Yeah, it's the market segment. Sometimes there's no other information even. So you want to take even the questionable information. I think the thing is that the bar for including that kind of stuff gets lower still if we just start reporting on public polls without any disclosure. Because ultimately, then if that's I don't see how you turn.
That was kind of the point I was making earlier. That I think the two things begin to affect each other. Mm-hmm. The dynamic is kind of mutually reinforcing. I think that's right, and I think it is a problem. All right, well, I'm glad we got that off our chest.
So that was
with
therapy.
that. I want to thank everybody for listening. Thank Josh for being here. Thank our crew in Liberal Arts Instructional Technology Services / the Liberal Arts Development Studio. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.